So this talk here deals with evidences for evolution, and what we're going to look at is how do we know that there's commonalities in life. A whole bunch of objectives that deal with this and some text readings. So what we have to do is assume that the processes that occur now are the exact same as what occurred in the past. Because if we can know what happens now, we could figure out the past. We call that uniformitarianism. So if I know how sediments fall now and the rate at which they fall now, what I could then do is assume that, if they fall at whatever the rate is, a millimeter every 100 years, then in the past it was probably something like a millimeter every 100 years, and probably in the future it'll be something like a millimeter every 100 years. It's not going to be exact, and you're going to have to do some adjusting, but it gives us an idea, a reference point. We point this out because we know how we can make fossils now. And what you have to do is have an organism die, and then it starts to decompose, or it gets buried. And when it gets buried, it needs to be buried in very fine sediment, which typically is associated with water. So if you're dying in areas not associated with water, odds are you're not going to become a fossil. And what you then have to do is hope that it gets buried, fossilized, so the bone gets turned into bone, or it gets turned into more minerals. And then at some point, it then also gets exposed. The point is, it's actually not common for things to become fossils. And even then, we have found untold numbers of fossils around the world. I point this out because a guy by the name of Charles Darwin documented a whole bunch of patterns that he observed. And I'm going to run you through some of the things that he observed. We're ignoring a lot of the current stuff that we could add onto it, but that tends to be cellular and molecular. So among those things is, if you looked at structures in the past, what he sees is that a lot of these organisms turn out to have similar structures. So if I were to look at these organisms here that are on the screen, they all tend to have related structures, meaning they would have parts of their jaw that are built the same way, or parts of their ear that are built the same way. But when you start to compare them, it becomes wait a second, how come these organisms here all happen to have this exact same little quirk of a bone structure, but one of them, a whole bunch of them look like they belong on land, and others look like they belong on the sea? That doesn't seem to make sense. Unless they're related, then it makes sense. But we could do the exact same thing with organisms that exist now. So I could take any type of arm and say that there's one bone, there's two bones, and then there's a whole bunch of bones. And this works for any type of mammal, but also works for like frogs and birds. So either this is a really big coincidence that all these organisms that look different, regardless of their size, elephant to a shrew, it's either all a massive coincidence, or it's not. They're related somehow. If I look at the distribution of organisms, like distribution of trees or of animals, like humans around the earth, what we notice is they don't seem to show up everywhere. And if I look at it in the past by looking at fossils, we find the oldest set in one location, and then they seem to spread out, which could be a whole bunch of independent coincidences, or there's a pattern, there's a relationship here. An example of this would be this fern here. It's called Glossopteris. Glossopteris, like I said, it's a fern, and ferns live in tropical environments. This map is where we find Glossopteris fossils. The bottom part of South America, which at last check is frozen. The middle bottom of Africa, which is really warm. India, which is warm. Australia, the middle of Australia, which is obscenely hot, but it's not tropical hot. And then you have Antarctica. Well, this is all kind of odd, unless all those places were once connected, and then the coincidence doesn't seem as odd. But we could do the exact same thing with all sorts of other organisms. So we could look at the camels, or the camel family, so that would also include alpacas and llamas and things like that. When we look for their fossils, we find them in North America. But where do we find them living now? South America, Africa, Asia. Well, that doesn't make any sense if we have all the fossils but they don't live here, unless there was a connection between them all and allowed them to move, then I guess that makes more sense. But that also requires a bit of a coincidence, or acknowledging that it's not a coincidence. If I look across the Earth, I also find other random bits of patterns. So if we go to the northern and southern latitudes, we don't find as many unique species, and if we go towards the middle, the tropical areas, we find more species. There may or may not be a pattern to that. We also know that there's a distribution pattern in terms of what biomes are found everywhere, which may or may not turn out to be a coincidence. We even look at organisms and we notice that some of them seem to answer the same question in different ways. Meaning, an example could be, how do you fly? Well, if you're a bat, it turns out to be your hand. If you're a bird, it turns out to be your arm. And if you're an insect, it turns out to be the skin on your back. But they all give you flight. And they're getting flight in different ways. It's not that one bone, two bone, bunch of bone. It's different answers. We get the exact same thing if we look at things like plants. So the organism on the right is a cactus, the one on the left is something called a euphorb or euphorbia, would be that plant. You look at them and you go, oh, well, they're clearly related to each other. Look how similar they are. The cactus is found in North America. The euphorb plant is found in Africa. And North America, even if we were to rearrange the continents and try and shove them all together, they don't connect, especially because the cactus is on the west coast of North America, not the east coast. So we have lots of questions about this, unless there are some patterns that exist, and then the coincidence goes away. We can also look at how you develop, which is a fancy word for how you develop. It's called ontogeny. And what we notice is during development, there is a story that seems to show up, a series of, wow, these look really similar, which could be a bunch of coincidences or not. The story is called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That phrase there, which sounds super smart, means your evolutionary history is told in how you develop. So all of these things here were known to Darwin in the 1800s. I have said nothing that was groundbreakingly new and that people in the 1800s didn't know. What made him famous is he put it all together and said, there's too many coincidences for it to be a bunch of coincidences, because in science we follow parsimony. And parsimony is the simplest answer wins. So if I say, oh, look at all these independently created organisms that have nothing to do with each other, but they have all these parts that are related to each other, that are similar, that is harder to explain than to say they're all related. And if that is an easier thing to explain, just to say they're all related, that is an easier explanation than saying they're all independently created and they just happen to be built the same way, then we go with the answer of they're all related because of parsimony, and science operates off of parsimony. So what we notice, the bottom line, is everything that we look at that's alive, no matter how we view it, in terms of whatever evidence, whether it's stuff that we can see or stuff that turns out to be a little more complicated, like cell parts or chemistry, it all keeps pointing to a commonality in all living things. And we call that evolution. And that's what we're going to be dealing with next.